I actually miss all the Celtic pride that used to be around. I think it is just as cool, if not even more so, a part of our heritage in the north of Europe. Really, the Celtic and Germanic peoples were not all that different at all. We are brothers of the north at the end of the day. So that's what this video is about, going over the oldest sources and archaeological finds to show you who the Celts really were and how closely related they were to the Germanic tribes that we all idolize here on this channel. So, very important, we can break down this history and the sources over many thousands of years. Some places will have a lot more Celtic than others, of course, but most of Europe are going to have a little bit of Celtic in there. Even me, I'm about as Germanic as it gets, but even I have some Celtic ancestry as well, just because of how far they spread and how long of a time period.
The DNA you mentioned.
Map in just a minute. But the main focus of this video is going to center around a few hundred years where we consider the most important and influential time period for the Celts. So when examining any native culture, you have to do it before outside cultural influence came in on the wide scale, okay? So the Romans came in and conquered most of the Celtic areas right around 2,000 years ago. And then that watered down the native Celtic culture. Christianity did this even more so in the following 300-400 years after that. So to really get an idea of what original native Celtic culture was like, we have to look at the history before the Roman invasion. Archaeologically speaking, the term Celtic refers to peoples who are sharing a similar material culture and artistic style that are unified in the regions of Central Europe right here. Origins back to 3,000, even 4,000 years ago possibly, and then they spread out with time. But we are not 100% certain that all of these places shown here were in fact Celtic by religion and language. Like I said, there's not much written evidence. We just have to go on the similarities on the archaeology. But the actual word Celt, referring to a people, we don't see that come up until quite a bit later on in time, which I will speak about where that came from in a minute. The mainstream academic view is that the Celts and Proto-Celtic language arose out of the Urnfield culture of Central Europe about 1000 BC. So this is the area where they theorize is the original homelands of the Celts, Celtic language and culture. And they had a massive expansion after that following the next 600, 700 years. This is the first real contact that we see, that we can prove among the Germanic and the Celtic peoples. During the early to the mid-Bronze Age, we actually see an incredible amount of trade between Northern Europe, which is referred to as the cultural area of the Nordic Bronze Age, or whatever. There's a few different names for this culture here, but essentially it was the Nordic Bronze Age and would have been the proto, Germanic tribe. Evidence of in archaeological finds was spoken in most of these areas. The earliest confirmed examples of the Celtic language are the Leptonic inscriptions from the 6th century BC. And we find recognizable inscriptions of this style of Celtic language all around Europe, all the way up until the 4th century AD in the Ogham inscriptions, which most of you may have heard of. The earliest runic inscriptions are dated to the 1st century. Of course, both the Germanic and Celtic languages would be much older than this, but at least we can say we have archaeological evidence that the written Celtic language is probably much older than the Germanic written language. That's all for the archaeology for this video. Let's get into some ancient meaning people of the descendants of the hidden one. This is also etymologically related to the Old Norse word Hel, so the underworld, the underworld goddess. And according to Julius Caesar, he actually said that the Celtic Gauls claimed descent from an underworld god. So there's one similarity there between the Vikings that we have sources there and the Celts. And that there were Celtic peoples in Iberia too, so the Spanish peninsula. So there you go. At the time, we're talking right about 2,000 years ago, The Celts were migrating and conquering everywhere, just like the Germanic tribes did about, 700, depending on what time period we're looking at. It's the migration period, so about 300 to 400, 500 AD. So their heyday was basically 700 years after the Celtic tribes' heyday and massive expansion. But let's fast forward in history to where the best sources come from, and this is ancient Rome. This was ancient Rome. This was Rome's heyday in history, and Celts. Writers from the time referred to the people of the British Isles as Britons, Britoni in Greek, or Britani in Latin, but of course they were Celts. We know this. Even Roman historian Tacitus, he says that the Britons resembled the Gauls in customs and religion, just as the Germanic tribes were unified by language too, by language, custom, and religion. But that's about the only thing that unified them, because they were all tribes constantly at war. The Germanic tribes and the Celts would have been exactly the same at this time period before the Romans came in and conquered them. So, what were the Celts like? This is the most important part. And how do they compare to the Germanic tribes of the same time? We're talking again right around 2,000 years ago, and the centuries around that. First, we need to get this subject out of the way, because a lot of people get it completely wrong and they're talking about it everywhere. A lot of people consider the Celts to be somehow inferior to the Germanic tribes when it comes to warfare and physical capabilities and the war spirit. So yeah, it's true, the Romans conquered almost all of the Celtic lands relatively easy, according to a lot of the history sources. While the Romans, they tried to conquer the Germanic lands too, but they were very unsuccessful. They barely made it into Germanic tribal areas. So yeah, that's true. They conquered the Celts a lot easier than they did the Germanic peoples, but that was largely due to the nature and surrounding habitat. The Germanic areas were heavily swamped and forested, and there were thousands of tribes. They were spread out everywhere, all secluded, and it was very hard for the Roman legions to march in there and bully a smaller, less capable force like they did everywhere else. In the Germanic tribes, according to Roman sources, that's the only reasons that the Romans were able to conquer the Celts a lot easier. It wasn't because the Celts were weaker or so much that they even took parts of Celtic warfare and they adopted it in the Roman armor, decorating themselves with animal furs to make them look ferocious. The Romans took this all from the Celts, apparently. We have many sources describing as much as they could, but still keeping it long like that. Also, Theodorus says during the later Iron Age, the Gauls generally wore long-sleeve shirts and tunics, long trousers, and a lot of these were even checkered. So even the Gauls did this, like the Scottish tartans from later on in time would be. I used a little AI to generate some images here based on this description of the Celts. So they would have looked something like this. They would not have looked that different from the Germanic peoples at all. They would have had same skin tone, same physical stature, just as big and strong, same hair and eye color. The only difference in appearance between the Celts and the Germanic peoples would have been, the clothing, hairstyle. Maybe there would be a little bit more ginger people, some more red hair in the Celtic world. But other than that, Celtic and Germanic people would have looked like brothers. Next big question, tribal, and as the Romans noticed as well, they referred to them all as Celts or Gauls or Britons, as too actually with their politics, as numerous Roman authors had pointed out. The Celts had pretty big cities, fortresses, and political organization. The Germanic tribes were exactly the opposite. They were tribes living in the woods, relatively unorganized, who united sometimes to fight off the Romans. The Celts, they were tribal too. Tacitus states that the Celts were a population scattered and barbarous and therefore inclined to war, or developed infrastructure in the towns and fortresses. Open sexuality, it seems, from the sources about the Celts as well. These are just the sources, but yeah, that would, if we are to believe those, it's up to you. And if the sources are true, that would be really the biggest and main difference between the Celtic and Germanic cultures. As you have seen by now, the Celts and the Germanic peoples were far more similar than different. They really were brother culture.